Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Okay, so you're trying to stay informed, right? But without wading through absolutely everything. Today, we're really cutting straight to the core of something pretty significant. These potential direct talks between Russia and Ukraine. Scheduled, possibly, for May 15th in Istanbul.
Yeah, that's the date being floated. We've looked at reports from, Russian sources, international outlets, trying to piece together the different angles here.
So our mission, if you like, for this deep dive is to understand these, competing perspectives and just figure out where things stand with these potential talks.
And what really jumps out right away is the U.S. president's statement about them. He actually mentioned he might possibly attend himself in Istanbul on the 15th.
Right. He said he understood both leaders, Russian and Ukrainian, might be there.
Exactly. Though he did add a bit of uncertainty about his own plans.
Yes, the scheduling conflict. Something about the Middle East.
That's it. But he followed up by saying he would travel if, and this is the quote, he believed his presence would be useful.
Useful. But he was pretty firm on the meeting itself happening, right? Between Russia and Ukraine on May 15th.
Very firm on that part, yeah. Insistent, you could say.
Okay. So turning to Russia then, what's their official line?
Well, the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, he put it as Russia being ready for let me get the phrasing, a serious search for ways of a long-term peaceful settlement.
A serious search. Okay.
But, and this is crucial, he also made it very clear, Russia will not accept ultimatums. Period.
No ultimatums.
Yeah.
Got it. So those are the sort of opening positions from the key players. How's the international media seeing all this unfold? Let's start maybe with the U.S., the New York Times.
Yeah, the New York Times, they sort of view these competing proposals, Kiev wanting a ceasefire, Moscow pushing for talks as basically moves by both sides to look like the ones pushing for peace.
Like positioning.
Exactly, positioning. And they set this against the backdrop of the U.S. president trying to, end the war.
Interesting. Did they connect it to anything broader?
They did, actually. It was quite insightful. They highlighted the sort of split-screen moment, European leaders visiting Kyiv right when Russia was holding its big WWII victory anniversary, attended by China's President Xi Jinping.
Wow, yeah.
And their take was that this really shows these shifting dynamics, like maybe weakening transatlantic ties and Ukraine sort of caught between a Russia that feels strengthened, with support from China, North Korea, Iran, and then Europe over here.
That's a really complex picture they're painting.
Oh.
What about from Turkey's perspective? A Haber.
Right. Haber had a political analyst, Hami Emre Berish. His point was that Russia's approach hasn't really changed. It's always been about trying to, in his words, coerce Ukraine into a peace deal without Russia giving up much.
Coerce, strong word.
It is. But Berish also really emphasized the fact that Turkey was specifically named as the potential host, the mediator.
Why is that so significant, according to him?
Well, he suggests it signals Russia's trust in Turkey's mediation efforts. Turkey's kept channels open with both sides.
So Russia perhaps sees Turkey as a more neutral, or at least acceptable, facilitator.
That seems to be the implication, yeah. It could make Turkey really pivotal if these talks actually happen.
Okay, let's hop over to France. Le Monde.
Le Monde reported on this idea of a ceasefire, but with a specific kind of monitoring attached. Monitoring mainly carried out by the USA, possibly with some European help.
U.S.-led monitoring. Why not, say, the OSCE?
Well, Le Monde noted Kyiv's reluctance about the OSCE precisely because Russia is a member. They'd apparently prefer U.S.-led oversight.
Makes sense from their perspective.
It does, though Le Monde also, interestingly, casts some doubt on how genuine the European ceasefire push really was.
Skepticism there, too. Okay, Germany. Süddeutsche Zeitung.
They covered the visit by the new German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and other European leaders to Ukraine. Mentioned they also spoke with the U.S. president.
And how did they report the reaction to the ceasefire calls?
They noted the Kremlin reacted negatively. Russia's counter was these direct talks, no preconditions, but crucially, they didn't directly engage with that specific 30-day ceasefire idea that was proposed.
So, sort of talking past each other a bit.
Feels like it. The Süddeutsche Zeitung also touched on potential new EU sanctions, continued military aid, but still that question mark over the Taurus missiles for Ukraine.
Right. That's been ongoing.
And one more thing from Germany, they apparently decided they'll stop publicly announcing their military aid specific.
Oh. That's a shift.
Yeah, could mean anything. Strategic shift, messaging change, who knows?
Let's move to Switzerland. Neue Zeitung. They often have a distinct take.
They do. And this time, they argued that Russia's proposal for talks in Istanbul is actually quite advantageous for Russia. They see it as a challenge to the U.S., which has been pushing for an immediate ceasefire.
How so? Why advantageous for Russia?
Their thinking is that by linking it back to the previous Istanbul negotiation framework, Russia might be trying to sideline the U.S. and Europe, whose positions Russia finds unacceptable anyway.
Okay, so a way to potentially isolate Ukraine in the talks.
Potentially. And the NZZ analysis goes further, suggesting this could pressure Ukraine towards accepting terms that look a lot like, well, capitulation. Things like military limits, neutrality, no NATO.
The familiar lists.
Yeah, plus special rights for Russian speakers, territorial concessions. They also pointed out that the whole security guarantees issue was never resolved in the earlier Istanbul talks because of Russia's demands.
And what about the events since then part?
NZZ thinks that's likely Russia signaling that recognition of the territories they now occupy is now on the table, a non-negotiable perhaps.
Right, the facts on the ground as they see them. Okay, Poland. Rzeczpospolita.
They reported on Kyiv's call for that 30-day ceasefire, noting it came out about 10 hours before Russia's statement about talks.
Ah, the timing is interesting.
And Kyiv apparently linked it to a threat of new sanctions if Moscow refused. Things like energy, banking restrictions.
So using potential pressure points.
Exactly. But then, Rzeczpospolita also noted Peskov telling ABC News that Russia has its own conditions for any ceasefire, namely stopping all Western military aid to Ukraine.
A complete non-starter for Kyiv in the West, surely.
Almost certainly. And the paper highlighted that the Russian president himself didn't directly address Kyiv's ceasefire proposal in his speech, just offered the talks instead.
So, again, very different tracks here. Ceasefire first versus talks first with totally opposing conditions.
Pretty much sums it up.
What about the Associated Press? Back in the U.S.
AP framed it as the Russian president having virtually rejected the ceasefire idea from Ukraine and its allies.
Virtually rejected.
Yeah.
Strong framing.
Yeah. And instead proposing these Istanbul talks on May 15th without preconditions, but suggesting a ceasefire could be agreed upon during those talks.
A subtle but important difference in sequencing.
Right. AP also mentioned this Russian counteroffer came after threats from European leaders to ramp up pressure if Moscow didn't agree to the 30-day unconditional ceasefire Kyiv wanted.
So a bit of diplomatic brinkmanship, maybe.
Could be seen that way. AP also added some important context, reminding readers that, hopes for ending the conflict haven't really panned out since the U.S. president returned to office, despite predictions.
Yeah, there have been moments that looked promising but fizzled.
And they referenced the U.S. president's past comments suggesting Ukraine might need to give up territory and his threat to pull out if a deal was too hard to reach. Adds a layer of history, let's say.
Definitely adds context.
Yeah.
Okay, what about a view from Ukraine itself?
Their reporting suggested that the initial European reactions to the Russian president's proposal for talks were, well, not supportive. Lukewarm at best.
Not jumping on board then.
No.
Yeah.
And crucially, they emphasize that the U.S. stance will be decisive. The implication being European nations probably won't take strong action unless Washington agrees.
Underlining the U.S. influence again.
Absolutely. It really highlights how central the U.S. position's perceived to be in Kyiv, and likely elsewhere too.
Finally, Al Jazeera from Qatar. What did they add?
They provided some background on Russia's previous ceasefire offers, like around Easter, the WWII anniversary, and claimed Ukraine had violated them. Of course, they also noted Ukraine makes the exact same counter-accusations against Russia.
The typical information warfare aspect, then?
Yes. But they also quoted Anatol Levin from the Quincy Institute. He suggested that both sides right now might just be trying to blame each other for the failure to get a ceasefire, especially with the U.S. president pushing for some kind of resolution.
The blame game.
Exactly. And Levin made a really interesting point. Who the U.S. president ultimately decides to blame Russia or Ukraine could seriously impact future U.S. aid and sanctions.
Wow, okay, so the stakes in just the perception of who is blocking peace are incredibly high.
Very high indeed. It could shape tangible policy outcomes.
So pulling this all together, it's definitely a complex situation around these possible Istanbul talks. We've got the U.S. president maybe getting involved, Russia saying they're open to talks but not ultimatums.
Right. And this whole host of international reactions, highlighting everything from geopolitical shifts to deep-seated mistrust and completely opposing preconditions for even pausing the fighting.
It really shows just how many different ways there are to look at this push for peace and how many obstacles are still in the way. Navigating all these viewpoints is clearly going to be key. Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear, new episodes every day.